What if everything you thought you knew about the Gospels is wrong? What if scholarship has been mistaken about the communities and their romanticism on the Gospels? Today, Dr. Robyn Walsh explains that the Gospels are not written by some spokesperson who's finally literate speaking to illiterate people, but were elites competing in a literary fashion amongst each other, because this was what Romans did in this time. The Gospels are written in a highly sophisticated way. And how does this factor into Paul? Well, our aftermath with the Q&A is a nuclear bomb. You don't want to miss this episode. I highly recommend this. I'm not kidding. Stay tuned. You'll learn something you've never learned in this episode. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Eric Lambert. Ladies and gentlemen, the guest that I'm having on today, Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh. I want to make sure I get the middle name.
Ironic.
It is, especially with what I discuss all the time. Are you still an associate professor at the University of Miami?
Yes, I am.
Awesome.
I just became associate. Yeah, I was assistant until 6 months ago, but now I'm an associate.
Excellent. Well, she earned her PhD at Brown University in Religions of the Ancient Mediterranean with a focus on early Christianity, ancient Judaism, and Roman archaeology. Before coming to the University of Miami, Professor Walsh taught at Wheaton College in Massachusetts. I believe it is, isn't it?
Yeah, there are two. But
Okay.
I was at the one in Mass. Yeah.
The College of the Holy Cross, and received teaching certificates and I can't even pronounce the term.
No, I can't.
Pedagogical, if I'm not mistaken, training at Brown University and Harvard University. She teaches courses on the New Testament, Greco-Roman literature, and material culture. I wish I could join some of the classes that she has on her website, robynfaithwalsh.com. And that's Robyn with a Y. So you can go check out the website. It's down in the description. Her first monograph, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, Contextualizing the New Testament Within Greco-Roman Literary Culture. The book is absolutely phenomenal. And I figure today we'll have the opportunity to listen to her do a shorter presentation, get right into some of this interesting stuff. You might be wrong about everything you think when it comes to New Testament studies. And that's what this book really did. So, Dr. Walsh, welcome to MythVision, and thank you for giving me your time.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to share some of my research and what I was trying to get at in this book. And I hope people find it interesting. And thank you for the support, too, for my research and for this topic.
Yeah, right. I'm thrilled. So I would be happy to hear what you have to say, and then we'll do Q&A.
All right, sounds great. So we're going to share screen.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And you can see?
I can.
Excellent. All right. So I can't see you, but try to, give me some kind of verbal cue if something starts to go awry, or if you have any questions, just jump in. That's completely fine with me.
Excellent.
So the book, The Origins of Early Christian Literature. One thing I like to do, because there's one thing to just kind of present your research, but it's another to actually talk to the person who wrote the thing and to get a little bit of the backstory. This image you see here, it's a bust, sometimes it's called a herm of Thucydides, and now I'm blanking on the other. I think it's Herodotus and Thucydides, back to back, as you can see. And this was originally the image I wanted for the book. I couldn't get the rights to it. And the reason I wanted it, though, was, unfortunately, but it's because I wanted to give a visual symbol of what I'm trying to say in the book, which is that there's a certain synergy among people who were literate enough and elite enough, culturally elite enough in the ancient world to write anything, really, that was sort of narrative prose in any kind of complicated way. And so I thought, because these two were historians, or what we might call historians more or less, that showing them back to back imagined together in some kind of network, some kind of literary network, was a nice visual for what I was trying to convey about the gospel writers. But again, couldn't get the rights, so ended up with this cover instead, which I actually have come to prefer, because I think that there's a lot of symbolism in this image that wasn't coming across in the other one. But here you have three of the gospel authors, the Synoptic Gospels, so Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And I like how they're kind of high-fiving each other, and also in an era of social distancing, they've got that going on too. So I ended up really liking this cover for that reason. But I also wanted to bring up that the title, The Origins of Early Christian Literature, wasn't actually the original title I wanted. And I had wanted the title, and the manuscript I submitted to the press said The Beginnings of Early Christian Literature. And so that's a theme we might come back to in the Q&A, and a theme for this whole talk, which is this obsession with origins that happens in the field of New Testament and early Christian studies with some regularity. You see it in scholarship, you see it in the kinds of discourses we have, the conversations among scholars, and even the kind of conversations that scholars have with the public. It always seems to be about what are the origins, as if there is an origin point for early Christianity, or that we can get at what we call these early Christians, or this earliest stage of the Jesus movement. To some extent, there are ways that we can access some of that information, but it seems almost like an obsession with the field to always come after this idea of origins. And what the consequence is of this kind of endeavor is that the only thing we really have from the first century, as far as we know, are texts like the letters of Paul or the Synoptic Gospels. And so we put a lot of weight on the sources to tell us a lot about, again, origins, because we're interested in it, but it might be more weight than those kinds of texts can bear. And that was one of the premises that I brought to this whole project. So thinking about who can write, and also why are we obsessed with origins, are really kind of the two focal points that I can point out at this stage for framing what came after. So today I thought I would talk mostly about the first two chapters, and I'll talk a little bit about some of the stuff that comes after. But again, anything in Q&A we want to talk about is totally fine. But the first two chapters will really give you a roadmap for what the book tries to accomplish. So as you can see here, the first chapter is called The Myth of Christian Origins. So no surprise with that title based on what I just said. And what the chapter does is really go through some of the assumptions that the field tends to make about, again, what we can get at in terms of an origin for Christianity, and consequently what that kind of methodology or that approach does in terms of producing certain kinds of expectations or assumptions about the social formations that bring about the kind of literature that we see in something like the Gospels. And also really tends to be a definitive set of markers for how we even imagine the evolution of early Christianity to have taken place. And so I wanted to scrutinize all that, to trouble it, to see if it bears, if it can bear up against what we do as historians with any other kind of ancient literature from the first century.
It might be cool, even if and I'm not saying I'm going to interrupt the presentation. I just think it'd be cool to jab things I think are interesting you bring up in the book. And it might help you along the way with your limited coffee inside. So what I'll do is just throw the ideas out there, see what you think. One of the things you said in your book that I found fascinating in what you're saying here is we put too much weight sometimes on these ideas of social, this gospel's to this community, and this particular community, here's this leader of this community probably, or someone who's a literate person in it to read this among these potentially illiterate
spokesperson.
Right. Yeah. It's just there's a lot there that you're pointing out. Maybe we start off wrong on this approach.
Yeah, I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. Actually, let me jump ahead. Yeah. So I've written on this because I've described what were this idea of this sort of spontaneous social formation that Christianity fosters among these earliest followers as a Big Bang. Now, I'm not the first person to say Big Bang. There have been other scholars that have referenced it, but I love that imagery if you're thinking about origins too, that there's a focal point and then just an explosion. And if you read something like Acts of the Apostles, that's the narrative that you get. X number of people converted in one day by just listening to some of the teachings of the disciples or the apostles, right? That's supposed to be enough or sufficient to create some kind of spontaneous conversion experience. And conversion in this case being like a wholesale turning of your life. So you imagine some of these people who are supposed to convert being quote unquote pagans who hear this message and then just stop doing whatever they were doing in their day-to-day lives, worshiping the gods, break all those familial bonds to just become a Christian because it's just patently obvious that this is the thing that they should be doing with their lives. That's rhetorically the message you get in these narratives. Practically speaking, that's almost never the case. Conversion is a lot messier. It's often not spontaneous. It's often not that widespread. And so there's back to this idea of certain work, there's work that these texts are doing and presenting even the concept of conversion in that particular way, or the idea that Christianity spread so rapidly, so cohesively, and so multiply the way that it does from what's supposed to be like this origin point of the historical Jesus. And consequently, when we think about the Gospels, here's a little timeline that I like to show in my classes to contextualize this. What you have is Jesus dies sometime around 30. You have this man, Saul, who converts, becomes Paul, and starts talking to various groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about those groups in a second, about his experiences of the risen Christ. Now, to be clear, Paul never knew Jesus. He never met him. What he's describing is that he has these visions of the risen Christ who is giving him certain information that he's then disseminating to the people that he's writing to. He has this, what we might call ministry between about 50 and 60. His letters, which often get lost, especially in English translation, are very much in line with what we see from other Jewish writers of the first century who have been trained and educated in what we might call Greek paideia, which is basically just school, the kind of schooling that was sufficient to learn to read and write. There are other scholars or ancient scholars like Philo and Josephus who have had the same thing, and they have in common with Paul that they often interpret scripture in terms of the popular philosophy of the first century. Sometimes it's called Middle Platonism, but basically it's a mix of Platonism and Stoicism. So a lot of the stuff that we even read in the Gospels and Paul, again, get lost in translation today. But when he uses words like spirit, the word pneuma in Greek actually means it's like a physical substance, and it has physical properties in Stoicism. And when you understand what he means by participation in Christ in terms of that, it makes a lot more sense than just the spirit. But after 2,000 years of using the word spirit, it makes sense to contemporary Christians without that background. But that kind of thing is going on in these texts that is often lost. Paul dies sometime around 60, 65, we're not sure. And sometime after the Jewish War, after the temple falls, that's when you first get the Gospels being written. And to your point, often imagined to be representative of the oral traditions of groups of Christians, the kind of groups that we imagine maybe Paul was writing to. But they're imagined to be illiterate, imagined to be kind of just like this rabble of people huddled together who tried to find some kind of literate spokesperson to represent that oral tradition for them. And then consequently, scholars will say, well, the spokesman must have written down the oral traditions. Those people selected stories that were important to them, those groups, those churches. And so maybe we can mine these texts to find out about the origins of Christianity by looking for the unique elements of each text, because that must represent the people who were asking for it to be written down. So an interesting kind of structure. I'm going to skip talking more about Paul for now, but oral tradition, which is the theory I basically just explained, does a lot of work for early Christianity to try to get us from that origin point to that point after the war that I just described, when we know these texts were being written. And there are reasons we can talk more. I'm sure you've talked to other guests about why we know that, including descriptions of the destruction of the temple that appear in like Mark 13. So it just seems pretty clear that the temple is already gone for various reasons by the time the Gospels are written. But to traverse that space and time, I mean, the earliest evidence you have for Christianity, for these origins, are the letters of a man who never met the historical Jesus. Then you don't have any stories about the historical Jesus until Jesus dies in 30 till 40 years later, at a time when life expectancy is about 24 years old. That's a long space of time. So how do you get from historical Jesus to the Gospels 40 years later? One theory that scholars have put forward over the years is the idea of oral tradition. So again, there are these stories that come either from disciples or the apostles, the early, leading figures of this movement after Jesus's death. They've passed on the teachings of Jesus. Those were passed down orally among these people, these collective groups who held on to it preciously over the generations. And then finally, they found a literate spokesperson to write them down. So that's basically the formula. Jesus teaches, he dies, sometime later somebody writes it down. Now, I have a lot of problems with this theory, and that comes across in the book. Among them, there are quite a few things, but one is that you have a problem. If you take the Gospels as describing the historical Jesus as in any way historical or accurate, what you have is a man who is teaching in Aramaic, who is teaching very locally, all things considered, to small groups relatively, and a small group of followers, and followers who are themselves illiterate. He chooses his followers among classes of people who would not have had paideia, fishermen, etc. So there is already a big problem because the earliest Gospels are written in Greek, just for one example. So you have a translation problem right away. You have basically a game of telephone, too, because you have whatever he said spoken to a small group of people. Again, assuming that the Gospels are giving us an accurate picture, and then you're relying on multiple generations to tell that story accurately, because there's often debates, is this word for word what Jesus actually said that we find in the Gospels? And obviously it's not word for word, since the Gospels weren't written in Aramaic. So that question's already off the table, because by the time you have it written in Greek, you already have one act of translation, right? So you have things lost in translation, possibly. So by the time these things are actually written, that's a lot to traverse in terms of the reliability of what we might call, again, origins of Christianity or the historical Jesus. So back to this idea that it's a lot of weight for it to bear, it's difficult to imagine that the literate spokesperson in the oral tradition framework is a really reliable one historically, just given everything else that we know contextually about the historical development of texts and writing practices in antiquity. So to me, oral tradition doesn't make sense as a main driver for the kind of stories that you have in the Gospels. And by the way, the other problem you have is that often things that appear in the Gospels are things that Paul said. And again, Paul never met the guy. So it may be that there are other source materials, written source materials, that are being used by whoever is writing the Gospels, and that is the primary and most formative both material that these writers are using, but also the most formative social group in terms of helping determine what appears in the Gospels, meaning the literate community around someone with that kind of schooling and the knowledge to write something down, again, in antiquity, in Greek, in narrative form, not in verse. Often things in oral tradition are in verse. That's not what you have in the Gospels. Someone to have that kind of competency, the people who are probably determining the content of whatever they're writing are their fellow writers in terms of just primacy. Doesn't mean that these authors, they've learned about Jesus somewhere, don't know some Jesus adherents, might not themselves be part of what's called an ecclesia, a church, but that may not be the thing that is most informative for them when they're writing down the Gospels. So the problem also with the oral tradition theory is that I always like to use this example too in my classes. If Jesus dies around 30, Mark is our earliest gospel written sometime around the Jewish War. It would be like us, depending on which gospel you're thinking about, writing about World War II or the Beatles or Elvis or the Bee Gees for the first time. And even that, I'm actually being kind of generous because the joke, I'm a big Beatles fan. So the joke I always give is, I can pretty much recite any Beatles song, but it's in verse and it has meter, in a way like Homer did. That's not what you have in the canonical Gospels. Actually, I don't think in any gospel you don't have Jesus speaking in verse or something that might indicate some kind of oral tradition. So with all of that in mind, I wanted to ask, and this goes into the second chapter, why then does it seem that the study of early Christian texts is so idiosyncratic? Why this obsession with origins? Why the obsession with the idea of the spokesman writing for the community? Why the obsession with oral tradition? And why have we... I wasn't even just concerned about why are we stuck in a certain methodological pattern, but it was more like, where did this come from, right? Where in the academic study of these texts did this get authorized as an approach? Because I can see it from the perspective of reading the Gospels from a faith-based perspective. Of course, the earliest Christians weren't literate and needed a spokesperson because the Christians in the Gospels aren't literate. Well, you have to be taking the Gospels very literally in that case, that they are giving a reliable history to then extrapolate from that by the time it's 70, like all of these Christians are still themselves, not literate, or maybe only one of them, in a big community is. I mean, even that framework to me seemed bizarre because it recognized how few people were literate to say that you needed the spokesperson, or maybe there's just one person in the community who has the ability to write these things down. That kind of gives it away that this was the purview of more of an elite class. So it just kind of didn't make sense to me. So when you get into a field and you become an academic, you have to do all kinds of research into the history of the field. You get all these general exams and tests on who wrote what, and you have to get up on all the theory and methodology. But at a certain point, it's a generational thing. Depending on your interest, you might go really into a deep dive. But generally speaking, you want to be up to date on the newest kind of theory and literature. So you might only go back, say 30 years, with the exception of a couple of texts that are really formative for the field. I went back even further. I went back to the 18th and 19th century. And the reason I did that is that the field of New Testament itself, at some point, I came actually from a classics background. And even when I taught at Wheaton, I was the Greek professor. I wasn't really teaching religion. Unless you consider, I consider the ancient Mediterranean, I consider it all religion, whether I'm teaching about the gods or teaching about Jesus or Judaism. But I was principally teaching, classics. And that was my background even going into this field. And there was a time, though, especially when the Academy first started doing a critical reading of early Christian texts, that the field wasn't divided. There weren't those disciplinary boundaries of classics and then religious studies over here. And when you go back to that period, and it's often the period is called the Romantic period or referred to as Romanticism. So this is a period particularly for the field of religious studies in Germany that emerges in the 18th and 19th century. And what you have there are a bunch of scholars trying to read ancient texts, but doing so in all the ways that I just talked about, looking for origins, trying to find oral traditions and the like among a variety of different texts, often for nationalistic purposes or often for political purposes in their era. So especially in Germany in the 19th century. And some of the tenets of Romanticism really started to ring out to me as indicators of, okay, this may be why this methodology both seemed sensible in the Romantic period and why it persists. So Romanticism was characterized, and this is very broad, but characterized by a few concepts that scholars reading, and especially ancient texts, were looking for. Origins, particularly among German Romantics, there was an anxiety that, well, we have all these ancient Greek and Latin texts, but what was the original Indo-Germanic language of the German people? Where's our identity as a people, especially politically at that time? Germany wasn't really a unified country the way it is today. It was a bunch of little statelets that eventually unified. And when that unification happened, they started wanting to look for evidence of their national heritage. And there was a lot of, again, anxiety that you had that evidence in a place like Italy or Greece, but not in the same way in Germany. So a lot of concern with what are the national origins and stories of the German people. That was a very, very common question being brought to ancient texts. And again, by people who there weren't disciplinary boundaries. You could work on the New Testament and work on an ancient German text and then, work on Homer. And that was perfectly fine. And you would bring the same methodologies to each. There is also a concern in Romanticism with the folk, the people, and wanting to get at the stories and the language and the oral traditions of the people, especially if you're looking for evidence of the origins of a people, in this case, the Germanic people, who didn't really leave behind the kind of text that Homer did or Virgil did, right? So you're looking for some evidence of the oral traditions of the people. And there was increasingly a sense in this period that the stories of the common man were more important than the stories of, although the stories of the great writers and poets, they often use the term the poet or the author geniuses, were also important. There was also a deep concern with what are the stories of the people that they shared, because there was also a feeling that knowing what day-to-day people were telling each other in terms of oral stories might reveal more about national character than just looking at the things that like the great writers of a period were producing. The best example I can give of this, sort of ironically, is Shakespeare. And you would think that why are the Germans looking at Shakespeare? If they're looking for their national heritage, why are they going to England? But the thing that Shakespeare did was he was supposed to capture the stories of the low-lived Elizabethan. He was capturing the story of the common English person. And so as a model for what they're looking for, he was a poet and an author genius, but he also captured what they often use the term spirit, the Geist in German, this spirit, the national spirit of the common people. And so that was one big methodology that you saw across the board. And then the other was a concern for community. And that should be clear from everything I've said in terms of searching for nationalist roots for particular movements and peoples. So when those are your concerns within a political, academic, structural framework, and this also happens to be the cradle of the emergence of both, the critical study of ancient texts, critical study of the Bible, and the field we now call religious studies, you can see the overlap between traditional methods in New Testament and what was going on in Romanticism. So essentially, I started to propose that while other fields like classics more or less abandoned these kinds of methodologies and terminology, recognizing that origins is problematic, the word community is so politically loaded, especially in France as well, in the Romantic era. These kinds of words tend to be scrutinized and understood to have their own context in English that's problematic, that we have a certain inheritance from it. It seemed as though, or like the concern with the oral tradition and not really critically engaging how oral tradition may be problematic, all of that seemed to be things that other fields had already contended with. But I wasn't seeing much evidence of that being addressed head on in New Testament. And another example, just briefly, to really sort of contextualize, other than Shakespeare, the kind of project that you often saw within German Romantic circles, the Brothers Grimm comes to mind. And this is, two guys that everybody's probably heard of. I think there was some Matt Damon movie, right? At some point. So everybody's probably heard of the Grimm brothers, and, they collected these Germanic fairy tales. Except their methods were really messed up. They weren't really collecting the oral traditions of a people. They were kind of filling in the blanks and talking to one or two people. And they didn't really have the credentials, honestly. They had some schooling and they had a lot of interest and they had some money and they wrote really mean letters when you disagreed with them. And that combination sort of raised them within popularity during the 19th, that German Romantic period. But as academics, but that whole, they're emblematic of that entire interest. There are other scholars. There's this scholar whose last name is Kuhn, who was doing the same thing, but had the credentials, was doing it legitimately, and interviewing common people to try to find out their oral stories. And he ended up writing a book that almost nobody read, that they really wholly dismissed. He's a German scholar. That said, you know what, when I ask people to tell me their myths, they just make them up on the spot.
Wow.
These myths, they evolve. He called it mythopoetics, basically, that they can be spontaneous and they might not be reliable. And everyone was like, no, 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 right? The Grimm brothers method was better. It gave you those oral stories. And so then suddenly, the terrain of Germany, you could start to look, to the material landscape for evidence of, like our Germanic fairies, right? Like you could start to come up with a richer background for the Germanic people through something like the Grimm brothers than you could by recognizing that myths tend to be spontaneously, somewhat informed, but not word for word and spontaneously communicated when they're passed down. So I like to give them as an example of the kind of methodologies. And the other thing, just briefly going on in the Romantic period that I think is important is that most of Germany was Protestant and did not like the Pope and did not like Catholicism and did not consequently like Rome very much. So Rome rhetorically in Germanic circles was associated with excess, with corruption, with, basically heresy. And on the other hand, too, was often described in terms of, the pagans. I mean, even that term, right, is so loaded. And so you have this idea of the Roman pagan being this kind of godless heathen, right? So you have nothing good about Rome and the imagination of these nationalistic, nationalistic inflected kind of approaches to ancient literature. So the idea that the gospel authors could possibly, if they were culturally elite, maybe more wealthy because they had the time to and currency to go to school. Maybe they are part of a literary network that the common man would have been, or the common person wouldn't have been a part of. That they were probably urban because that's where the best schools were, and that's how you could best circulate anything that you're writing. That would be your origin story for Christianity. That it's a bunch of Paul was not a poor guy. He might have in later life, said he was a tent maker. It's not quite clear. Is he actually doing that work himself? Is he making other people do it for him? He was a Pharisee. He was very well educated. He brags about his birthright. So even he has that kind of education where he knows philosophy. He can, put together the means for this letter writing. And if the gospel authors are the same and these guys are all sort of like upper tier Romans, that's not going to work. Because the Romans in this period are no good, like they're these indulgent, godless heathens, right? So all of that is conspiring, I think, in the 18th and 19th century to make it seem impossible that there's an alternative historical framework for these texts, that must be oral tradition. It must be these small communities of illiterate. Often the word used in German was primitive Christian. So that's what these scholars were looking for, because that's what they were looking for in their own literature. So going back to those roots really helped me see how New Testament has continued or the study of the New Testament has continued to perpetuate these models and perpetuate these methodologies. By contrast, I will say this: we don't know a lot about early Christianity. We don't know a lot about the origins of this movement. We know mostly about Paul. We don't even know who wrote these Gospels. These attributions, these names are later, just so people wouldn't confuse their manuscripts. So we don't even know who wrote the Gospels. It's all shrouded in a lot of mystery. So it's difficult for us to draw any firm conclusions about the social lives of the people who produce this material. Again, maybe apart from Paul, although even Paul, the groups he's writing to, doesn't seem like he talks about other competitors. He uses words like super apostles. The Corinthians don't seem bounded at all. So the idea that even these groups he's writing to are cohesive at the time he writes to them doesn't seem that way. And so he seems kind of like an outsider often to those groups, although we can talk more about that. So we don't know a lot about Christian origins, actually. What we do know about, though, as historians, is how Roman education worked in the imperial period, how writers made decisions, how things like writing within genre expectation dictated a lot of content that we find in other kinds of writing. And then natural extension to that is, why would the Gospels be any different, or what we call the Gospels be any different from any other kind of ancient writing? So to produce something like this, And this is the Rylands Papyrus, sometimes called P52. It was, we think, dated to the early 2nd century, and it's a little scrap of the Gospel of John. It was found in a trash heap somewhere. To be able to even produce this required a lot. I mean, there's the paideia I'm talking about, the time, the education, the investment for the kind of education to write this down. But also think about like how expensive it is to even have a piece of papyrus in the ancient world, or this ink, or someone, even if you are dictating, to write it down for you, all the social elements that have to go into the production of something like this, that is the purview of a cultural elite. And I want to be careful here. I say cultural elite, and I don't mean elite like rich people, although I'm sort of implying that, but you could have people, I give the example in the book of Epictetus. He was a slave who had been educated to educate the household that he had been sold into. So here's somebody who, didn't have rights themselves, but had the education because of a different social context. So that's why I like to use cultural elite. But it took a certain cultural elite to be able to produce this material. So you had to be culturally elite, you had to be highly educated, and you were always part of some kind of literary network, both to lightly publish things by reading them out loud and presenting them to people in different social networks, or exchanging them within certain groups. You would kind of have like your favorite editor friends that you might share something with. And then publishing in the ancient world, you would have to hand copy things. It was a really laborious process. But to do that kind of act of publication required a whole network of other literate elites. And so what would it mean if the Gospels were part of these kinds of networks? Now, the first example I can give you of evidence of that kind of network working for early Christianity are the Synoptics themselves. Again, why I liked the cover of the book in the end that we picked. Because what are the Synoptic Gospels but evidence of, Matthew reading Mark and saying, I can do a better job. And then Luke literally, and the preface to his own gospel, I think I have a slide of it here, being like, I've read all these other gospels. Oh, they stink. I'm going to do my, I can do this better. I mean, what you have are, competition between writers, all saying that I can do it better. And that really represents what I think, here it is, what we have with other literature in the ancient world, and the ancient Mediterranean world, and especially the 1st century. So that to me makes a lot more historical sense than a more convoluted story about spokespersons, like a literate poet who represents the folk stories of the masses, right? What you actually have in something like Luke's preface is, somebody paid me to do this. I've read a bunch of other writings. I can do a better one. So that's essentially what he's saying in this preface. And it's the kind of preface you also have from other historians like Thucydides and Herodotus.
If I may, on that one point, though, just to point out, the intro, a lot of people make a lot of this whole, just as they were handed on to us by those from the beginning, this is where they would argue the oral tradition, or they're talking to eyewitnesses. And you've mentioned this in a previous time. I mean, you go through a lot of content trying to present this. So one of the things I thought was interesting you said, and maybe you might want to mention, just so it's from your mouth and not mine, is that other authors would say, oh, these are eyewitnesses, but they weren't. Like this, is that where you're going with this? Oh, yeah. I'm sorry.
No, but hey, you're
jumping the gun. This is awesome.
No, but you're with me. This is why I wanted Thucydides and Herodotus, because Herodotus would say, I talked to eyewitnesses who told me, and then he would say something really batshit crazy, right? So classicists are like, yeah, he didn't talk to anybody who saw that,
Right.
But in New Testament, we're like, oh yeah, talking bears, or whatever it is, right? We're like, well, there was an eyewitness. But this kind of preface is all over the ancient historians. And ancient biographers, they always say something like this. I talked to an eyewitness, because you have to, because otherwise, why would I believe you?
What about just throwing this out there? What about Tacitus, where he says that he knew someone who saw, or he talked to an eyewitness, something like that, who saw Vespasian heal a blind man and a withered hand of a guy in the temple of Serapis. He stepped on the man's hand and his withered hand was healed, or the blind man, he spit literally in the man's eyes. And
I don't want to smile at this. Yeah. I just realized I'm smiling while you're talking about,
No, but it's just kind of like, I know that it's funny, like this probably is not. This is to bolster your emperor, I suspect, or
well, yeah, the funny thing, or take him down. When you have this is the interesting thing about Jesus too, that I hint at in this book, and I think it's going to be the premise of another book, which is love the empire or hate it. Jesus is a perfect subject. Because here is a Galilean peasant, a Jewish man, right after the fall of the temple in, Jerusalem, where everyone in Rome, I mean, what we call the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheater, was built with the money from destroying that temple and robbing it.
Yeah.
The Arch of Titus, all the coins that were depicting, Judea Capta, the Jewish people as a woman, naked woman with her hands tied behind her back. I mean, you couldn't negotiate physical space without that narrative being somewhere. And so there's a lot of curiosity. There was curiosity in the first century about Judaism, generally speaking. We have lots of evidence of Jewish people. I mean, whether or not it's absolutely true, but we have, Roman legal codes saying that Jewish people are getting kicked out of Rome because they're interpreting dreams for a fee. So there's curiosity about ancient scripture. The Jewish scriptures were very ancient. They seemed, compelling to people outside of to Gentiles, people outside of Judaism, probably why anyone listened to Paul in the first place. And then you have, this narrative that's implicitly about empire, right, with Jesus, because he's the real leader. And, what happens to him, the treatment that he receives basically at the hands of the empire, it does the same kind of work that you're describing. Rhetorically, it presents a commentary, whether overtly or covertly, that's a political narrative. And I think that kind of thing is happening with the Gospels as well. And it's, again, after the war, an amazing subject matter for a writer of the imperial period who wants to make that kind of comment. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So I think there's a lot of evidence with the Synoptic Gospels in particular, and we can talk a little bit about John, but he's not, he's another writer who's engaging in this subject matter and evidently has entirely different sources. So back to the oral tradition theory kind of falling apart. So rather than oral traditions of communities being passed down, and because it's replicated in 3 different instances with the Synoptic Gospels, it must be evidence of an origin point from which this big bang happens and then disseminates itself into 3 different communities that all record it, but slightly differently. What you have more evidence for are elite educated people who are just writing within literary networks, to my mind. And that is a much more linear description, historical description of what you're even seeing in something like Luke's preface, right? Or the evidence of usually the words redaction, how are the different gospel authors editing different stories about the so-called historical Jesus. I think they're just being normal first century authors and writing a story about Jesus and the aftermath of the war, and things again like Eyewitness. That kind of rhetorical device is all over the preface that you would find to Herodotus, the kind of preface you would find to Thucydides and others. So then the last piece, and I'll do this kind of quickly because I want to make sure I give us plenty of time, is I say all of this in the book, and then I thought to myself, well, if I'm saying that these are normal Greco-Roman authors, the gospel authors, there must be evidence somewhere outside of Christianity for other writers to be reading them or engaging these texts, because I can't posit that they're part of kind of this, cultural and limited elite class of people who can read and write, and then say, but they're still kind of isolated on their own. That doesn't really make sense. And so I started to look around for evidence that maybe there are some other Greek or Roman authors who are aware of the Gospels, or at least engaging in similar themes. And one place where there are more examples that I've since found that I'm trying to work on for the next book, but, want to kind of keep under wraps for now, just so I don't spoil the next book. But in this one, I talked about a text called the Satyricon. And it's usually attributed to this guy named Petronius, and he's supposed to live in the first century. So some people think, I'm not the first one to have noticed that there are similar stories in the Satyricon and the Gospels, But a lot of people will be like, oh, well, if Petronius was in, the Roman household of the emperor, maybe the emperor was curious about Mark. Like there are all kinds of stories that try to go back to oral tradition. I won't even bother with getting too deep into it. But in classics in recent years, there's been a lot of convincing evidence that the attribution of Petronius to this text is actually just erroneous, and that the text shows more evidence of being from the 2nd century and more or less anonymous, because we can't quite tell who wrote it. Mm-hmm. And some of the evidence for this includes references in the text to letters that Pliny wrote to. There's a collection of the letters of Pliny, who was a governor in Bithynia, including letters to the Emperor Trajan saying that there were Christians in Bithynia, by the way, one of our earliest pieces of evidence that Christianity is existing as a cohesive unit. So this is somebody who's writing possibly in Pliny's circle, and some of the elements of his story in the Satyricon, assuming it's a hymn, seem to mirror some knowledge of early Christianity and maybe these texts, these gospel texts. So a couple of the examples I give and this is going to be too much text, but I just want to put it up on the screen for people to give them kind of a taste of what I had in mind here. There's one story where this guy named Trimalchio, here, let me jump ahead, has basically a mock funerary meal for himself with his friends. And he says that he wants them all to imagine themselves invited to his funeral. And then he talks about dividing his body among them for them to eat after his death. And so the idea of anointing his body before death, having some kind of ritual death meal ahead of basically like an execution, and then dividing his body among his followers afterwards, those themes definitely present in the Gospels. So he says, all of those who are beneficiaries in my will, and he uses the word testament, can take what he has given his body under the following conditions: that they divide it into parts and eat it in the presence of people. Otherwise, they'll have cursed my spirit. So, sounded a little New Testament-y to me. Sounded a little gospel-y to me. Another one is when Trimalchio is talking about this funerary meal that he's posing to his friends, cock crows, and he gets really upset because it seems to him to be kind of an omen of death. And basically he, because it's a comedy, he cooks it. But the idea of the cock crowing, before the predicted death, also pretty New Testament-y. Another example is at the tomb in Mark. I give the example here of the women who go to the tomb and they see that it's empty and they flee in terror. I didn't talk about the Satyricon here, but just one other example from the Greek novel by Chariton. This idea that you would go to an empty tomb and then surmise that whoever was supposed to be in that tomb, now that they're bodily absent, is a god, was all over ancient literature. It was all over the novel. It was all over mythology about Romulus and Remus, about certain emperors, about other, human beings who become deities. Basically, within Greco-Roman literature, when your tomb is empty or your body disappears after death, it's an apotheosis and you become a god. So the description that you get in the Gospel of Mark of the women coming to the tomb, seeing it's empty, they panic. And they're amazed. That idea of being kind of amazed and stunned by the revelation that the bodily corpse of the person has disappeared and therefore must be deified. Very, very common in this literature. So the book kind of goes on along those lines. I have a previous publication with David Constantine that also makes it into the book, that talks about how the Gospels do appear to be more in terms of genre classification, like an ancient biography and a subversive biography. So it's kind of an underdog figure. And there are a lot of examples from the 1st century that this fits into that trajectory. So that's basically what the book does. It tries to, I'm going to escape here.
All right.
Let me stop the share. So can you see me?
Yes.
Okay. So does that get it across?
That was, there's a lot there. And the whole, so I guess we'll start with a couple things. If that's okay with you. It's not like all the other interviews I've seen of you where this is like a professional at a college that's asking.
No, I'm leaning back.
Right. let's so we get the gist of the Gospels. Maybe I want to take us through your thinking of like, how does this impact how we are now looking at the criteria? Like, we're not taking this oral tradition approach. We're seeing these are elitist writing. They're very well educated. They know what they're talking about. But we're saying Paul is rooted in history. Here's this guy. He's highly educated, as you mentioned in this presentation. What's Paul up to? If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about Paul, and then maybe I'll get us into a couple examples. Maybe you can work through your thinking with me, and we can kind of discuss what you think's going on.
So Paul, actually, when I went to grad school, it was for Paul. It wasn't for the Gospels. So this is a deep love for this guy, or I love the subject. So I think what's going on with Paul is he, again, is a Pharisee. He's highly educated. I think, and I don't want to make it sound like I'm putting on him all kinds of like intentionality and like a backstory. So just, take it. I'm doing a description here and we can kind of untangle it. But in a period when, again, like I was saying, we know that people are interested in Judean stuff. They want to know about ancient Jewish scripture because it is ancient. There's something really interesting going on there. You have writers like Philo of Alexandria using Platonic thought and popular philosophy of the day and Stoic thought to say, hey, whatever you thought Plato said, Moses said that way earlier. Like there's this kind of competition going on because of the antiquity of those texts and people being, meaning Gentiles, non-Jews, curiosity about it. People like a Philo, who was actually part of the Roman imperial family by marriage, or people like Paul, who are highly educated, are able to parlay that knowledge they have, that deep knowledge they have of those texts. Paul, by the way, is reading the Hebrew Bible in the Greek translation called the Septuagint. He shows evidence of that all the time and the way he cites the Jewish scriptures. So he's reading even a Greek version of this material. And so he is reading into it because he's so well educated, all of the popular philosophy, just like Philo is. And that allows him to communicate not only the antiquity and the importance of the Jewish scripture itself, but then engage in popular philosophy, like the cutting edge science of the day, right? Like Stoicism has like a lot of material elements where they're trying to explain like how spirit, the word we use for spirit, is a material thing that can like go into your body and change like the composition of your body. And like they're trying to do all kinds of these explanations that are scientific for the period. So Paul's combining like the compellingness of these ancient narratives with the popular philosophy. And he's talking to these people and trying to engage them, because otherwise, if he didn't know these things and couldn't come up with these like philosophical proofs for what he was saying, why would you listen to him? Yeah. Why would you abandon like your entire life? He's basically putting together a really comprehensive program for explaining why what he's saying is legit. And then plus he's got this whole end of the world thing that's kind of creates a little immediacy. But like as time goes on and the end of the world doesn't come, he has to also you see like in his letters as they go on, like by the time you get to Romans, he has a whole other theology about how like, well, you're not right. You're not acting right. And that's why. And here's like a moral way to act, an ethical way to act that conforms with Stoicism, that if you act like this, then Jesus will return, right? And all of that has imperial underpinnings of, like how unfair things are, and we're going to be the true inheritors of a kingdom, etc. So he's tapped into the antiquity, he's tapped into the sacred texts, he's tapped into the political elements, he's tapped into popular philosophy. And he's well educated enough, and again, that was a rare thing, that he does kind of become almost like a spokesperson, except not quite, because the people he's writing to, he may have that elite education, but he's giving the people he's talking to, even if they didn't go to school, even if they can't read and write, the opportunity to talk about these things and to engage in that kind of paideia, even if they don't have the formal training. I think that's why he's successful, to the extent that he is. And I actually don't think he's that successful. Like the Corinthians are not listening to this guy very well at all. Some people say Philippians and Galatians, he's having a better time, but he definitely tells someone, to castrate themselves. I think it's in Galatians, right? Yeah. So,
Galatians 5, I believe.
Yeah, exactly. He tells him he hopes the knife slips if he tries to circumcise himself. And that's because he has other people kind of competing for their attention, right? So he's not the only game in town. And so I think the other reason Paul persists, though, is because I think when the gospel writers go to write down stuff, what's floating around like a limited number of texts out there because a limited number of people can write. What's out there are Paul's letters, right? So there's a recent piece in a Festschrift, I think it's for Stan Stowers, written by Emery Lyondike, who's at Princeton. I think she's at Princeton now. That might all be wrong. I'll correct it if it's wrong, but it's definitely Emery Lyondike. But she works on the Oxyrhynchus Papyri. And there was a library of one individual who had thrown away a few letters of Paul. He didn't have all of Romans. He had like 3 pages of Romans. But he also had all kinds of other stuff in his library. So the idea that you could be an elite Roman male, again, usually man, with the means to have the kind of library where you can kind of, fool around all day, reading and writing and maybe trying your hand at a few things. Even someone like that had some of the letters of Paul because he's a great Middle Platonist. He's a really creative thinker. He knows these ancient texts. And so you want to try your hand at, a story of this Jesus guy. Because what Paul provides is a story of Christ. Because he never knew Jesus. He rarely tells us anything about the historical Jesus. He doesn't really care. He gets no authority from that. He tells us that Peter and James are still around. Those guys get authority from having known the historical Jesus, but they didn't write anything down. Paul did. And, he's authorized because he has the most recent intel. He talked to the risen Christ. And so that's what he emphasizes. And he writes it down. And then 20 years later, after the fall of the temple, when someone's like, hey, what's going on with this historical Jesus guy? What do you have lying around? Paul.
So Paul, okay, a couple of things, and I know this seems minuscule, especially coming from what you do, the arena you deal with. These are questions that probably don't really matter at the end of the day, but they're questions I like to ask because, like, for example, I've went and visited Dale C. Allison Jr. He's more on the oral tradition side of things, and then you have others who have a different perspective, who are probably more in the classicist field, like my good friend Dennis R. McDonald. Different people, right? And one of the things that there's this like argument from apologists who think Paul, when he says in 1 Corinthians 15, he was buried and he rose again, they think buried means in a tomb. And people make up much to do with this. And they go, well, Paul never said he was buried in a tomb. The tomb narrative was created by Mark and it wasn't in Paul. Do you die on that hill? Are you willing to say maybe Paul did have a tomb narrative? And reason I ask isn't because he really knew that here's this guy who was really buried in a tomb. But in all these Roman stories and all of this literature, maybe Paul saw this motif. And I say that I know this is horrible. I'm jumping to Acts, which is definitely not Paul. It's late in the game. But in Acts 17, there's this interesting quote put in the mouth of Paul, like the Socratic teacher, who says, and it is written, your own poets have said, Epictetus, sorry, you put that in, Epimenides. He quotes Epimenides about you two are the offspring of the gods. And it talks about these Cretans. So if you start looking into that, they thought they had this cave, this burial cave where Zeus was buried. So I'm going, what is going on in all of this literature? Is Paul in that vein? And is it okay to say maybe Paul did think tomb, but we're not talking about a literal down the street here. We know where it's at because they would have probably been there worshiping at this tomb if they knew where it was, if there really was one. That's another critique of the whole apologist approach. But what are your thoughts about the tomb thing? And I know that's one specific question, but
yeah, I'd have to look at the Greek to see what word he uses. And, 1 Corinthians 15, the thing I like about that passage, I've actually been writing about it right now, is him talking about that whole taxonomy of different kinds of flesh, and the resurrection. Because I'm actually writing something about the moon right now. And he talks about the moon and the stars and the sun in that section. So it's important to me I would want to look at the Greek, and I don't have it, I'm not going to fumble for it right now. Because when Paul makes those kinds of references, generally speaking, he's usually quoting something from the Septuagint when he does it. So my guess is there's something going on in the Septuagint that makes him choose that word. So that doesn't make him the same. It's not the same thing as the empty tomb or references to the tomb because you're trying to indicate Jesus as a god now, right? That was my point at the very end, like saying the Greek novel does this. There are all kinds of traditions within, the myth around the Greco-Roman gods that do the same thing. That to me is a literary device that the gospel authors use to convey this is his status now. And remember, like, we don't have plagiarism in antiquity. There's, not all of these, constraints on publication that we have now. You were actually expected to make that kind of allusion to show that you were like with it. Like you know enough about ancient writing practices and you're skilled enough to make those kinds of allusions. And the more of those allusions you could make, it's often a quality of a period called the Second Sophistic. The more allusions you can make to, like, I'm so well read, I know what I'm supposed to do now. He's a god, well, his body's gone. The tomb rolled back. Oh, well, I see that in the novel all the time. You see what I mean? Like that. Yeah. That's a different process among the writers than what I see Paul often doing, which is trying to prove something, right? So Paul's often using language trying to prove something because he's trying to convince the people he's writing to that he's legit. If you assume that Paul's already legit, then you can kind of skip that stage, and then start to make more of those literary connections. But I would want to look at, is Paul referencing something that happened in the Septuagint? Because he often talks about to Jesus as cursed on a tree, right? Instead of saying he was crucified, explicitly using that language. He uses it elsewhere. But that's back to the Septuagint too, because he has to explain to these people why this non-citizen Jewish person who was, given the worst punishment, form of capital punishment in the ancient world, is now somebody you should, abandon your whole lives for, right?
Wow.
So he has to make a plausible case that's more involved. So does that help a little bit with the question?
That's an interesting point to consider. And I definitely want to re-examine thinking buried, what is going on here? Because people make that historical as well. They make that very historical, and they want to say, what kind of burial? Was he just a criminal's grave? Was it just, and they delve into this as a historical question rather than maybe a theological one. I don't know. And so the other question I have in Paul, and we'll get into some other stuff as we go, Paul, he talks about the Lord's Supper, this supper of Eucharistic.
So glad you brought this up. Yes.
Yeah, I am a fan of looking into this and going, what is it? I've had people talk about mystery cults. I've had, that are in the vein of potentially something here. We know that there was eating and drinking of the gods that we see with Osiris. You can look in some of those sources. So what do you think is going on with Paul? That's a better question to ask rather than putting words in your mouth.
So why does he bring up the quote unquote Last Supper? Meal? That
one, I'd love to have you address that. And just in general, why is he teaching this supper? People want to historicize that too. They want to go to Mark, Luke, and Matthew in some way and say, this is Passover. This is not a Eucharistic divine ingestion of the God. Like, this is something historical that becomes paganized when Gentiles enter the movement. So there's a lot here. There's a lot here anyway.
So, okay. I love that example because it's a perfect encapsulation of the kind of alternative theory that I'm trying to push here, which is when you read the account of the so-called Last Supper in the Gospels or in Paul, if you open up like the HarperCollins Bible and you look at like the little footnote in the bottom, because they're usually telling, that's why, like I could open up on the Bible and be like, tomb, Isaiah, blah, blah, blah. You know what I mean? Like you always get those kind of references. So that's why like you all have Google, you figure it out. I'll figure it out later. But when you go into that, those footnotes in the study Bible, it always says like, some version of interesting. This same meal comes up in the Synoptic Gospels and it comes up in Paul. There must have been an oral tradition or at the origins of the movement, like something that, traversed all of those fields. Like it was passed down to Paul and Mark and Matthew and Luke. And that's how it's ended up in all four. Wouldn't an easier explanation be Paul doesn't give a story like I talked to James and Peter and they told me they were there. He says, zombie Jesus appeared to me and told me he did this thing. When he does that, it's because he's trying to get authority for saying, I didn't know him, but I know stuff that happened to him because he's appearing to me, in his resurrected form. And so I actually know more than these other guys. I'm like the new Jonah. For some reason, God picked me. I'm here to tell you what happened. Here's how I know, because Jesus is telling you, like Christ. Christ is appearing to me and telling me, I even know about this, supper story, right? So that's the context that he's bringing to bear. When the gospel authors pick up that story, I mean, the simpler explanation is they read the letters of Paul and was like, well, they were like, oh, there was a supper. Like, let me include that, because apparently, this is something that is already, extant in the record. It's just one option, right?
Right.
But it's a different historical model than the one we typically assume, in terms of, like, trying to figure out, how do I make this fit, because it doesn't fit my expectations of what's supposed to be happening, right? Because then you have something like the Satyricon that comes in, it's like, has a whole character doing the same thing that has nothing to do with Passover, although that character by his name is Jewish, Trimalchio, which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
So there's something going on in terms of literature here that's really interesting, that I think goes beyond just worrying, like, what is this meal in terms of my expectations for what should be going on within Judaism in terms of, correct practices, etc. Because the other thing to me is, I think people like John Kloppenborg have convincingly written about, when Paul uses the word ecclesia, the word church doesn't exist yet. He's talking about an association. These associations have meals all the time, right? Like, that's part of it. If you're part of an association, which in antiquity, you'd have associations that had, a deity sponsoring them for all kinds of things. And Paul's taking collections just like an ecclesia would do, whether it's an ecclesia to Christ or to Zeus or to, any other god, Serapis, whoever, he's doing the same things: meals, collections, organization. He has a hierarchy. He's trying to implement all the same things that you would see in other ecclesia. And Kloppenborg's most recent book, I think it's called Christ Associations. He goes through, he doesn't obsess over the Christian material, but he gives all the examples we have from the Greco-Roman ecclesia that, have nothing to do with Christianity. And it's really, really interesting. So that meal, I think, needs another look.
You're making me have to buy another book. I love
Sorry.
it. Oh no, it's good. It's good. So, okay, couple things. I loved your Satyricon connection, and the rooster, the cock crows. I think you mentioned in one of your examples in another video about crucified men.
Oh, can I tell that story real quick?
Please.
Really fast. The Satyricon has something that's called the Widow of Ephesus. It's a story that existed. It's called an Ephesian tale, so long before, first century BC. But in this particular version, in the Satyricon, there's a Roman soldier guarding 3 crucified men, and he hears someone weeping in a tomb, and he rolls back the tomb, and he finds the widow of a deceased man crying there, and so he brings her all kinds of food. Long story short, she gets over the grief, if you know what I mean. I think the way that the story puts it is, they give into the temptations that tend to happen when you have like a full stomach of like food and wine, right?
Right.
So for 3 days and 3 nights, they're basically begging in the tomb. And then when the Roman soldier comes out, he realizes that the family of one of the men has taken his body down off the cross. If any of the Roman, authorities figure out that he abandoned his post to be doing what he was doing. So the widow says, well, why don't we just take my husband's body? Like, he's not using it, and we'll put that up on the cross instead. So it'll look like, nobody was missing. And so that's what they do, so that she can save use the dead man to save a live one. And so the tomb is empty, his body goes up on the cross, and the Roman soldier gets saved. So that's in the Satyricon. So, I read that and I'm like, I've got Trimalchio having a funerary meal, dividing his body, cocks are crowing, and the next thing you know, there are 3 men on a cross and a Roman soldier, with an empty tomb. I mean, like, all of those motifs together. I'm a little bit agnostic, actually, are the gospel authors reading the Satyricon? Is this just a Satyricon, a satire of Christianity? If you believe recent lines of thought and classics, that it's a 2nd century text, somebody who knows Pliny's writing to Trajan saying, they're Christians, what do I do with them? Yeah, it could be a satire. But at the end of the day, all of those motifs are just common in literature. So if you're writing ancient literature, you might throw in an allusion to the Ephesian tale, right? Like, even if it's starkly different in the Gospels, all of those motifs they're there, and they're just a way to tell a story. So if the Gospel authors are not as obsessed with origins as we are, if that wasn't their, we assume they're trying to record oral tradition. This is super important to them. Their point is to record the origins because that's what we want. if that's not what they wanted and they're just writing because they're writers, even if they're part of a Christian group, whatever, they're going to still make the kind of allusions to something like the Ephesian tale that everybody else already knows.
Wow. It makes me think of the, what's the theory where they give him poison or drink and he faints and he survives the crucifixion in the tomb after 3 days.
Oh, yeah.
I can't remember I don't know why I'm drawing a blank, but yes, I'm not saying that that's what's happening, but it just makes me kind of wonder, no wonder why people are trying to say, well, if this is historical, he survived. And they're writing these stories as though they could, like, they're real, but they're not. They're literally literature. So I have to ask you the $100 or $100 million question. And it may not seem like that to you, but it is with the people who watch my channel. I've been interviewing Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald for quite some time. He has been ignored. I mean, absolutely, like, black.
I quote him. I think he's in my book.
Yeah, I'm thankful that you've done that, because whether or not, and this is me and we've talked.
Yeah, he's in there. Homeric epics and the Gospel of Mark. Yeah, I use him. Okay.
See, I'm glad somebody's paying attention. At least, Dennis and I've talked, and Dennis is, kind of a little bit like irked at the guild, right? You've probably going to deal with it yourself, especially with this kind of hypothesis, because it literally rolls over everybody in their tomb. Speaking, they see what you said. They're like, oh, you just literally took everything we did and just, all right, new idea. It's really a brilliant idea. He admits that many of these connections he makes are weak. Some of them, not all, but like a lot of them, he thinks might be a stretch, may or may not be. He said, but some of them are clearly, it just seems to be obvious to him. And he said, I've been looking at it, and it's difficult when you're looking at Homeric Greek versus just regular, I guess you'd say.
Yes, the Koine Greek, yeah.
Yeah, and he says it's difficult because they expect a verbatim from Homeric Greek. But he said anyone in an ancient school that are learning have to know the Homeric epics and the Iliad, and it's in the air. So he said, this is the problem he has, is it's not, do you think there's mimetic? I have a book open here, and I'm going to copy. That's not what he's trying to convey. He's saying, I want to show you this is in the air and used by them. And if they're elite authors, as you're suggesting, then it would be, I think, obvious that they're aware of Hector, for example, being dragged by the chariot for 3 days by Achilles, and the hero of the city who gets killed, then the cause of the destruction of the city. Here you have Jesus, the hero of the city of Jerusalem, get killed, the destruction of the city, and 3 days he's dragged by Hector. His body doesn't fall apart. Jesus, not one bone, and it fulfills prophecy. I mean, it just over and over, he makes these echoes. Then his father goes to Achilles and asks for the body. This is probably a stretch. Joseph of Arimathea. The name Joseph, at least, is indicated to be the father of Jesus. Not saying he is the father, but the point is he goes for the body to bury him, etc. And over, I saw this and I said, man, this is beautiful. Even if you thought some of the connections aren't right, what's going on here? And I'll shut up by simply saying, do you find, I don't know how much you've read of him, but do you find that there is some truth to this? Dennis is upset that people who are writing commentaries, even if they don't buy the whole mimetic, they don't even mention, oh, this is an allusion. This seems like it might have come from the Greek. No, they're always Hebrew Bible, Hebrew or Septuagint, over and over and over. It's all they focus on. Sorry, I had to get my
No, I love that. I'm with him for a lot of reasons. There's actually like 6 different things that popped into my head while you were talking that I could reference, but not treating this literature like it has to be special, right? But depending on the assumptions you make about that social context, and this is kind of my point, you're going to lose those cross references or lose that context, because if you don't understand these if you understand these texts as the definitive oral tradition passed on and codified by a community that's finally written down. And by the time it's written down, it's been so repeated and cherished word for word that, of course, this gospel writer, with a few, slight variations because of whatever's happening in the community at the time, might emphasize one thing a little bit differently than the other, but it's like, the historical Jesus that can't be touched, right? If that's your picture, the community and that social formation as the most formative, then of course you're not going to look to literature, because what would that mean, right? Like that destroys that whole idea of trying to get at that origin and the primitive Christian, etc. But I can tell you that, having looked a lot at ancient education for this book, like there are some, like I hear about some of those or read about some of the tests that those people took. Like, no, thank you. They would have to write me a monologue of what Medea would have said if she decided not to kill her kids. Like, please, like these kind of like, you would have to do character studies basically. And like take your, try your hand at like, can I write a better version of this? Or can I fill in a blank? Right, that is missing from the story of Hector. But you would know all those motifs. And, I sometimes will say to people, when I write, it's in English, it looks like a paper, or it looks like an academic paper. You can't really write an academic book and pretend you're a creative writer. It just doesn't. Like, I'm married to a poet. I'm not going to try to write this in verse, right? Like, there's a genre form that you have to take to convey this information, citation practices that I have to observe, or they're not going to publish the book. And the people in antiquity, they don't have plagiarism or exactly the same kinds of, it's not a one-to-one kind of, comparison, but they have their own habits and they have their own expectations, and they're going to follow those, right? And so I don't think it's beyond the stretch of the imagination, what New Testament people and sometimes people who, and I don't mean people like I'm outside of all of I do like deep studies of texts as well and comparisons and that kind of thing. There's a lot of obsession in the field though with breaking down a lot of also the teachings of Jesus into like these minutia of like, what about this preposition instead of this one, right? Or like exactly what is being referenced here. That has been a methodology that persists for generations, and it's very interesting and it is revelatory in its own way. But if you've spent that much time like trying to do those kinds of comparisons within like scripture, it's going to seem a little weird when you start doing it, say, with Homer, because it also, again, challenges what you think about the backgrounds of the people who are writing these things and the social context that they're in. But I think the more we break that kind of stuff down, and I think that he has done that, MacDonald has done that with a lot of his work. I mean, the other thing that popped into my head is I'm writing right now about Freud and his approaches to religion. And the thing about Freud is everybody quotes, like day to day, we're all catharsis. I mean, Aristotle used it, but like when we use it today, that's from Freud, or Oedipal complex, or, talking about your id or whatever, or your ego, like that's all. Thank you, Freud. But I don't think a lot of people like go back and totally like read. I mean, if you go back and read Freud in the German, like you're not going to be a happy person. Like that wait until the thing I publish, right? But when I start to think about how even I use like Freudian terms, and I don't even realize like we are still imbued in like Freudian thought and terminology today. And I see it in scholarship now sometimes too. Like people are invoking Freud, they don't even know they're doing it. So sometimes you're swimming in certain intellectual waters, and people day to day, or even in, scholarship or other kinds of writing, they're not even totally conscious of it, but it's happening, right? Just depending on how discourse is going on in the period. So I think the more we do that kind of work, sure, you might not be able to take Homeric Greek and compare it to the Koine and, make a proof like this was what. But that's why I tried to be careful with the Satyricon. I'm not trying to prove anybody's citing anybody, but I mean, damn, like these motifs are there, whether it's the empty tomb, the Roman soldier, and these are things that also appear in plays, so people who even attend, the theater might encounter these kinds of character types. All of these things, I think, should be factors in how we imagine this literature function in the first century.
Wow.
And later.
There's so many things. What about the three men crucified in Josephus' account? The three of his friends, and I don't know if you heard this, but in his,
I'm trying to remember.
It's in his, maybe it's in his autobiography? I'm not sure. He wrote about three of his buddies that were crucified, and he went and asked Vespasian to take them down. Or was Titus at the time. I suspect it was Titus. I cannot remember if it was Vespasian or Titus. Either way, he goes to ask them to take him down. They take them down. 2 of them died and 1 survived from the wounds. So this is in Josephus. This seems to be maybe a literary thing in his. I don't know, but I am scratching my head going, maybe what if this is a motif? What if this is something like you talk about, did one borrow from the Satyricon or vice versa? What if there's something they're both in the Greco-Roman world pulling from? There might be something we just don't have right now, or I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just thinking.
It's always a possibility. And, Josephus is an interesting case because he'll write about one thing under the auspices of the Flavians that makes them look really good. And then he'll rewrite it later when he's not, under their thumb, and it's a totally different story, So you always have to contextualize what he's saying too. Right. I think often when he's writing his histories for the Flavians, I've always been a little bit curious, how much is he under duress when he's writing this? Because he's essentially a prisoner of war. So it's never been completely clear to me what his status is. And so I think that's also something to factor into. He might default to the literary when in a tight spot, because I think he was being closely monitored in some of the things that he wrote.
Wow. One little thing that came to mind when you talk about this literature, this Greco-Roman, in the literary, rather than just the scripture, if I can use the term, I mean Septuagint, is they'll say as it is written, or it's written, or they'll quote. And that that's a direct mimetic, if you want to use the term, or borrowing using this literature. Oftentimes people will say it's recontextualization taking place. So for their own intention, whatever the author has. If there are these elite, I'm asking you maybe in your framework, they're these elite, most likely Roman authors in some sense. We don't know their ethnicity. Probably we might have we might lean in certain directions. I don't know in your view.
They're probably men for sure. We can say that. Yeah, it would be odd if they weren't. Yeah,
and they're quoting not only the Septuagint, but Dennis would say, for example, look at the not the Odyssey, the Aeneid. The Aeneid is using Homer's Odyssey, the Iliad, and never once says it is written or I'm quoting. They just rewrite it. They don't say I'm using this to write this anywhere in it. He just rewrites a story and never references it. There seems to be references in the Gospels, but then if there is this mimetic narrative connection to the Homeric epics, Iliad, Odyssey, Euripides, the Bacchae, and Acts, whatever it might be, they don't quote it. They just use it. And what are your thoughts on these authors?
So, I mean, when they're quoting, say, the Septuagint, or making reference back to Jewish literature, again, it's an authorizing strategy. What I'm saying is legit because this was predicted, or what I'm saying is legit because this is, again, Judaism is respected and protected to a certain degree in the imperial world because it's so old. And so to reference those texts, you're also saying, what I'm saying is not out of left field. As it was written, this is the kind of thing that's going to happen. Nobody is questioning the foundational nature of Homer, or the purpose of Virgil writing is to kind of reestablish a new foundational epic, right, for those who are in power. So he doesn't have to be like, well, as Homer said, everybody, knows he's not having to make a proof, right? They're already in power. He's not in a position where he has to try to create legitimacy or authorize himself. But the Gospels are, right, to the extent that they're trying to tell a story that's rooted in this other kind of literature, this sacred literature or scripture, whatever you want to call it. They're going to have to make these callbacks to, it was written here, and this is how, this fulfilled a prophecy. This is how this fulfilled something predicted. Because Jesus is the predicted Jewish Messiah, right? That's the whole premise. We tend to lose that with Christianity, but the whole premise, even for Paul, is Jesus is Jewish, followers are Jewish, Paul is Jewish, right? It's a Jewish movement that, Paul is the outlier who starts talking to the Gentiles because, as it was written, a certain number of Gentiles have to return to the fold to recognize, the Jewish God as the one true God in order for Jesus to institute, or Christ to, institute this kind of final, whatever's going to, battle that's going to happen,
That sounded like Paula Fredrickson, actually. I don't know if you know her works, but she says that same thing where the nations, this predictive, the nations, and if he's a rabbi, he's aware that in the end times that I wonder if that spark with the apocalyptic fever that was already in the air, looking at the Qumran sects, etc. It's just in the air since Daniel. I mean, everyone thought the end's going to end any moment now. The Qumran's doing calculations. It seems like there might be calculations in Paul's head. I don't know, but I'm guessing. But my question in that vein is do you think that seeing the God-fearers coming into these synagogues and the diaspora sparked that as like, why are non-Israelite pagans out here, these Gentiles, coming and finding real serious interest in the God of it? I'm kind of
I don't think so much, only because I mean, often these God-fearers, that's kind of an interesting category, and I'm glad you brought it up, because even in inscriptional evidence, like they never fully convert, but they still are wanting to be a part of the synagogue or the community. And so I think it just highlights, we have a tendency to see three categories: Jewish, Christian, Roman, right? But it's a big, you couldn't necessarily tell walking down the street who was who, right? So I think it just shows that those divides are our divides, maybe not what's really dividing people as concretely as we tend to present it in the ancient world. So I think that the God-fearers, I don't think were the catalyst necessarily. I think for Paul, the catalyst, and why I think he's down with this whole like the end of the world thing is happening, is because when he has these experiences of the risen Christ, and I have no reason to challenge him on that. I don't know that he's making it up, right?
Right. It's
but
okay
when he
to
has
say
that,
he had authentic experiences.
I'm not trying to like throw everything out, right? So I'm not going to question that he had these experiences, but what he describes in having those experiences are, I know that this guy is legit, because when we take over, because we're the chosen people, and when God's kingdom is here on earth, etc., he's going to take away all the evils, right? And the first evil, he says, is death. So if Jesus defeated death in his resurrection, we know it started. It's like the first domino, right? And so then everything else is going to follow. And part of that process has to be that some of these Gentiles, as it was written, are going to, incorporate themselves into this movement. So I don't think Paul thinks he's a Christian. He never uses the word. I don't think I think by maybe the period of Romans, like there's a little bit of like, what am I doing here? Right? Because I think he thought, I'm just incorporating some Gentiles. You have a whole new covenant. You don't even have to circumcise. You don't have to follow the dietary laws. Your covenant is baptism, Eucharist. Like he establishes a different covenant for the Gentiles. But Jewish people keep doing what you're doing, right? But it seems like a holding pattern, the way he describes it, right? But he does see that first act of resurrection being the clue. Like this is how it's going to happen. And so he does describe himself like a new Jonah. Like my job is, for some reason, God has picked me. And so I have to help usher in this new age. And I'm pretty sure when that war in Jerusalem started to happen with the Romans, I'm guessing a lot of people thought that was it. Yeah. And then it didn't go the way it should have. And then after that, you start to see Gospels. I don't think that's a coincidence. So I think that there's something that happens in that interim where you have kind of a look back at, what teachings might we have missed? Not because the oral tradition persisted. I'm not saying that, but because I think a lot of stuff comes from Paul, or is filled in again with what we're talking about, motifs from literature and other things. To figure out, because what we were expecting did not happen. So, you're muted.
Sorry, you brought up resurrection, and just to end on this note, because there's so much what we can discuss and get into. I mean, more questions keep coming up in my head as I'm like, okay, this is really interesting. Wondering, how do we fit this in? Resurrection. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, flesh and blood does not inherit the kingdom of God. We have this clear indication that it's spiritual. Now, like you said, pneuma, the wind, spirit, however you want to define this in Greek, it is physical it's tangible in some sense, but it's not physical. What I mean is like, if I die and you say, well, Derek spiritually is resurrected, you're not going to look at my corpse and say that came back. It's something, but it's not the category of like that, what's rotting oh, and now it's not rotting. What do you think's happening? How does your paradigm explain what scholars will say is this development where here you have spirit, then you have empty tomb, but there's no appearance, and there's this cutoff and mark, which is such an enigma for so many people because they want to try and find a way where communities are fitting in. And
oh yeah, that's a terrible ending if you want community. That ending of Mark just sucks if you want community. Yeah.
I'm not saying later on communities they tacked on something, but the point is
because they had to.
They end up having him say, "Hey, Thomas, you see that? Feel that? Hey, flesh and blood doesn't, or a spirit." He says in bone, which is weird that he chose bone instead of like, or bone and flesh and bone instead of flesh and blood. But really weird that that's used in John. But either way, touch me, feel me. A ghost does not, or spirit does not do this. What's happening in your paradigm that this Gospels are starting to make him more physical?
So I think Paul does it too. And this is actually something I'm working on right now. So I'm trying to do that thing where I'm balancing, like,
if you have to say I can't answer right now, we'll follow up. I have another question if not. So
no, I'll answer. Let me try and answer because I think this is important. So a few things. One is only extra special dudes get like the full body, and ladies get the full body resurrection like right off the bat. Right. So that's the empty tomb thing. Like that's reserved for like super special. So I think that that's one thing that's going on from a literary aspect. In terms of what Paul's saying in 1 Corinthians 15, I think he's being very stoic or Middle Platonist in his understanding of pneumatic bodies, especially in that section, like, what is it, 34 to 42 or something like that, where he really breaks down, there's one kind of, he uses sarx, so flesh. There's one kind of flesh for animals, one for fishes, and then, talks about there's one flesh kind of body that you have on earth. And then you have this pneumatic body. I think he literally means you're going to have a pneumatic body, meaning you're going to have a body that's made of this extra refined godlike stuff. Now, if you read an author like Plutarch, who writes in the same period, he writes something that's called On the Face of the Moon, and he's a Middle Platonist too. What he says is that what happens when you die is that your body goes into the earth, and that's your first death, because the earth is going to subsume the body, decompose it. When that happens, your what we would call your soul and your mind, so your nous and your psyche, rips violently from the body and shoots up into space, basically. And if you were a person who wasn't attached to your body, then you're actually going to either, your nous is going to fly into the sun, and your soul is going to basically implant in the moon and kind of purify itself in like the solar wind. And then it'll either like go off to Elysium, or you'll be put into another body. So that's like for the wise man, right? But if you weren't and you were attached to the body, you're just going to kind of be like a spirit that sort of like a daimon that kind of floats back and forth. You can intercede in human events, but you're not going to have a physical form. So there's a lot of people talking about this in this period. So the idea that you would have some kind of body that would take on some kind of material form that might be more ethereal. Like one thing that philosophers always do, especially the Stoics, is, if you see a god appear to you, they're very much about like sense perception being evidence for things. If a god appears to you, it's going to look like it's a solid, but if you touch it, it's not. So like, is that, like, what do we do with that? Like, what kind of knowledge is that? Is that like deep scientific knowledge, or like, do we just like, how do we make a judgment on that? There are all kinds of debates about it. So my thought is that Paul, being a good philosopher, I think the gospel writers are aware of this kind of philosophy. And I think later writers are also trying to engage this. They're all trying to kind of find a happy medium between how they describe this either in literary terms or philosophical ones. Does that help a little bit?
Yes, and I don't want you to give away too much, because I can't wait to actually like read your upcoming work. This makes me, with a capital G, want to deal with the Gnostics, but we're not going there. Maybe someday I can talk to you about maybe how this, because this is really interesting. It would make a lot of sense where these wild groups come out.
Like the Josephus theory, like he's just a ghost on the cross. He didn't really suffer. Like, don't worry about it. Well, no, he has to suffer, right? Like, so these debates about the nature of the body, the nature of the spiritual body versus the physical body. I mean, we see it in Paul, but it is throughout. So when you see a gospel author sort of taking a tact, you have to, I think, think, is this for purely like stylistic literary reasons, like what do I see as the cross references from a literary standpoint, but what also is trying to be conveyed about this particular writer's positionality as it pertains to whatever's going on philosophically in this period, where you see different things coming from the quote unquote Gnostics, or different things coming from someone like Plutarch, or Philo talks about it a lot. So, you know, this is, there's no definitive, like nobody has like, this is the way people think, you know, your body, how to represent your body. But I will say, yeah, you know, when certain emperors and founders of cities and, you know, heroes and, or like the example I gave from Keraton, you know, like when certain mortals become immortal, the idea that the body shoots right up, like the whole thing, that's out there.
So you think Paul might be thinking physical and, of course, because
he seems to be thinking both. But he talks about basically like a divine city, where it seems like he thinks, because there's an anxiety in the letters from the people he writes to who are like, you know, Joe died or whoever, like Bob died.
Yeah, in
like,
First Thessalonians,
like, yeah, like, so you said we were going to have these like pneumatic bodies, but like Bob's decomposing. Like, how does that work? You know what I mean? Like there are a lot of, it seems like he is saying one thing and then it's coming out, you know, in a different way.
This is so much fun. Okay, I'm going to have to let you go. I got to ask one question, though. This is about Matthew. We talked about this as the whole paradigm has changed with your theory here. That Matthew, it's you and other scholars are in this milieu of thinking that I really appreciate. Yours is a groundbreaking work. Go get the book. Matthew, everyone says this is a Jewish, practicing Torah observant Jewish community that is broken off, if you will, from the synagogue, from, you know, maybe a form of Judaism. I'm not sure. How do you view Matthew? Because I am still confused by this author when he writes seemingly Jewish only. I mean, like for the whole book, then he's like, now go. But there's hints throughout this Jewish only to like, oh, well, this the centurion gets it. No one in Israel gets it. This guy's got the best faith. Every time it can point to a non-Israelite, or I say non-Jews, Gentiles, it seems replacement theology type of, I guess, or something, what people call that. I'm confused. I'm very confused. Go only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Don't go to the Gentiles. Don't go to the Samaritans. But then Luke leaves all that out. He doesn't want you to see that stuff. I don't know. What do you think?
So a couple of things there too. And just a warning that one earbud just died and the other one gave me a beep, beep, beep. So we'll see how long I make it with the AirPods.
This is it. And okay. I'm letting you
all right.
go.
So if you lose me, we might have to change the audio. So Matthew clearly has read Mark. I don't really dispute that. And he's real creeped out by the exorcisms. He doesn't like that stuff. He doesn't like any of the, you know, like pneumatic spooky stuff, like all that. He's, you know, he takes all that out, right, for the most part. And I think he saw in Mark, like we're really not enough references back to scripture, right, for the reasons that we've already talked about. So I can kind of shorthand that. And so that seems to be his kind of unique intercession into what I see as kind of a competition between authors. But the other thing, and here I'm very influenced by the work of Stanley Stowers and a scholar named Aaron Roberts, who's at South Carolina, who has written that in many ways, the Jesus in Matthew is very stoic because he's angry a lot. And the way that he talks about anger, and Erin Roberts had a dissertation at Brown that's going to come out as a book with Oxford University Press. And she points out that the way he talks about anger is exactly how the Stoics do it. So in a way, he's just like Philo or just like Paul, a Jewish writer, possibly, or at least somebody who's well versed in that scripture or in that world, who is also well versed in the popular philosophy of his day and merging the two. Now, if you come from, not you, but if one comes to this text from the position of like, oh, well, it's a Jewish community and they've left the synagogue and they're mad, and that, like, if you try to do that community reconstruction approach that I'm saying, you know, is a bit dubious given that whole Germanic, you know, German scholarship background, romantic background, then you can start to see, you know, maybe this is actually just like a Jewish inflected approach to Stoic ideas, with Jesus as that central figure who's negotiating that. So I recommend everybody take a look at Robert's. I think Stowers has one article on this, and to look at Robert's book when it does come out, because I think it's going to be another one of those ruptures in the field that really causes a stir.
Ladies and gentlemen, RobynFaithWalsh.com. Thank you so much for your time. This has been fantastic. I hope I haven't bothered you too much with this long recording. No. I really enjoyed this. Go get the book. You don't want to miss it. It goes into far more detail than we can even get into here, but creates more questions, which means more ideas we can consider. But I feel like you're so much closer to things just by what I'm reading. I'm like, now we're getting somewhere. And that's how I feel about it.
Well, I think it's going to open up conversations. That's what I want, because I often hear people say like, oh, well, there's nothing else for us to do. Like, we've looked at all these compared. And I just think, no, only if you kind of accept what we've inherited in terms of method and that kind of thing. But I hope it opens a conversation for new ways to approach this material and get to know it better, whether you're from a faith background or not. I think it'll help you understand these origins.
Thank you for your time. Yeah. Any final words?
Just thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk. I love talking about this stuff. I could talk about it all day. So
I love hearing it.
So thank you very much.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Let us know what you think down in the comment section of this discussion. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts and ideas, maybe for upcoming episodes, of course. I really look forward to it. And if you're lost, you don't know your way, you're trying to figure things out, just say these 3 words. We are MythVision.